The night sky over Moscow was red, not from the setting sun, but from the city itself. Flames climbed like walls, devouring wood, glass, and silence. From the western hills, Napoleon watched, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes reflecting the inferno. For the first time in his life, he had taken a capital and lost everything that came with it. It hadn't started as madness. It had started as genius. Summer 1812. Europe's most feared army, the Grande Armée, poured east across the Niemen River. Nearly 500,000 soldiers drawn from every corner of Napoleon's empire, Poles, Italians, Bavarians, Saxons, even reluctant Prussians. It was meant to be a fast war, one thunderstrike to bring Tsar Alexander to his knees. One decisive battle, Napoleon said, and Russia will beg for peace. But Russia refused to play that game. The deeper the French advanced, the more the ground itself rebelled against them. Villages were empty, fields blackened, bridges collapsed. Every mile looked the same, and yet every mile hurt more than the last. The Grande Armée was designed to feed on movement, conquer fast, live off the land, press forward. But here the land was gone. What remained was ash. What the French called cowardice, the Russians called patience. It was a kind of war Europe had not seen in centuries, one that prized space over territory, endurance over speed. As Napoleon pushed forward, the Russian armies retreated, dragging him deeper into a world that was both vast and hostile. Supply trains stretched for miles. Horses starved on their own harness straw. Soldiers looted abandoned barns and burned what they couldn't eat. At Smolensk, the French caught up. Almost. The Russians defended, withdrew, and burned the city behind them. It was the first time Napoleon's men smelled what would later define the entire campaign, the smoke of absence, of something denied. From the Niemen to Smolensk, from Smolensk to Moscow, that smoke never left the horizon. When Napoleon entered Moscow in September, he expected the end of the campaign. A treaty, a triumph, a stage for peace. Instead, he found an echo. The city was nearly deserted. The streets were filled with the silence of abandonment, and then the crackle of fire. Within hours, the old wooden quarters were blazing. Within days, the entire city was an inferno. At first, Napoleon refused to believe it. Who would destroy his own capital? He muttered to his staff. The question itself was the answer. Russia would. It wasn't a single spark. It was a system. Fire leapt from house to house, driven by dry wind and deliberate hands. Soldiers caught men in uniforms of Moscow's own fire brigades carrying torches. Grain stores went up like gunpowder. Churches, homes, warehouses, all lit with the same purpose: to deny the conqueror shelter, supply, and satisfaction. For Napoleon, the horror was strategic. Moscow was not just a symbol. It was supposed to be the hinge on which the war turned. A captured capital meant peace, leverage, legitimacy. Instead, it meant nothing. No government to negotiate with, no supplies to feed an army. Only the illusion of victory. He was standing in the heart of an empire, but it no longer beat. As days passed, the fires grew until even the Kremlin's towers glowed red. Horses collapsed in the courtyards. Men coughed from smoke, desperate for water that had turned to ash. The emperor, pacing between broken windows, stared into a city that was teaching him a lesson Europe had forgotten: that sometimes the only way to win is to give the enemy nothing to take. Outside the walls, the Russian armies regrouped. Kutuzov, the old field marshal, understood something Napoleon did not: that this war was not about one battle, but about duration, about who would still be standing when the land itself turned against man. "We will retreat until time fights for us," he said. And time did. By the time the fires in Moscow died, the true battle had already begun. not on open ground but in the arteries of the French army, its stomach, its supply lines, its frozen breath. What followed was not a war of swords, but of hunger, cold, and distance. The Grande Armée had conquered a capital but lost the campaign, and soon the retreat would begin, one step at a time, one corpse at a milestone, one empire dissolving in the snow. The fire in Moscow burned for days. When it finally died, it left behind something worse than flame: silence, streets of ash, skeletons of buildings, horses gnawing the leather of their reins, a wind that smelled of smoke and rot. Napoleon had conquered a city and found nothing to rule. He moved his headquarters into the Kremlin, that ancient citadel now half choked by soot. His officers pitched tents inside palace courtyards. The emperor paced through the ruins, waiting for a message that would never come. A letter, a peace offer, a sign from Tsar Alexander that the war was over. But the Tsar was silent. The only sound was the crack of collapsing timbers and the distant whistle of wind through broken domes. Inside the French camp, hope began to shrink. The Grande Armée had marched 200 kilometers from the Niemen River, consuming the land behind it like fire. Its supply system, already strained, had snapped. Wagons sank into autumn mud. Horses died by the hundreds each day. In the empty streets of Moscow, men butchered dead mounts and boiled belts for soup. Every night, soldiers stared into the red glow on the horizon, asking themselves what it had all been for. Napoleon's letters from this time read like confessions. He wrote to Alexander, "I implore peace for the sake of humanity." He wrote to his marshals, "We cannot stay here." Yet he stayed. Pride held him where reason would not. To retreat without peace would mean admitting failure. And Napoleon was not a man who retreated from symbols. The Russians understood this. They didn't need to attack. They only needed to wait. Around Moscow, their forces hovered like wolves. Kutuzov's army shadowed the French lines, never close enough for a decisive battle, never far enough to let them rest. Cossack cavalry struck at couriers, stole horses, burned foraging parties. In a radius of miles, everything that could feed a man or horse was gone. The French army, once the mightiest in the world, was now an island of hunger in a sea of emptiness. Then came the cold. The first snow fell in early November. Light, harmless, almost beautiful. The men laughed. They had campfires and blankets. They were soldiers of Europe. They could endure a little frost. But the frost grew teeth. Within days, temperatures plunged below freezing. Horses stiffened and died in their sleep. Muskets froze. Bread turned to stone. Fingers split and bled just from touching metal. And still, no peace came. Napoleon waited too long. On October 19th, he gave the order to leave Moscow. The retreat began not as a march, but as an evacuation. Columns stumbled through the burned outskirts, through ruins still hot underfoot. The soldiers marched west, toward Smolensk, toward home, dragging wounded comrades and cannon wheels through snow and mud. The army that had entered Russia as a precision machine was now a bleeding animal trying to find its way out of a trap. The Russian strategy had worked because it was invisible. There was no single moment when Napoleon lost, no grand defeat on a map, only a steady subtraction of food, of horses, of men, of time. The Grande Armée began to dissolve from the inside out. Regiments no longer had commanders. Companies merged into ghosts. Marshals argued about roads, about the pace of the march, about what was left to save. Along the way, they passed the same towns they had burned on the advance. Smolensk, ashes. Vyazma, ashes. Every house that could have given warmth was gone. Every well was dry or poisoned. Every step westward was through the consequences of their own conquest. By late November, the army was starving. Men fought over scraps. They stripped the dead of boots and coats. Frostbite turned hands black. The roads were lined with corpses that looked like sleeping men, except their eyes were open to the sky. And still, Napoleon's banner led the column. The emperor, wrapped in a fur cloak, silent, face hollow. His genius was not gone, but it had nowhere left to work. All his plans assumed an enemy that would meet him in battle. Instead, Russia had offered him a mirror, a reflection of his own arrogance, stretched across endless land. As they neared the Berezina River, the full horror of the campaign became clear. The Grande Armée had entered Russia with over 600,000 men. Less than 100,000 now remained. Of those, half could no longer fight. The retreat was no longer a campaign. It was survival. And survival, Napoleon learned, could not be conquered by strategy. What Russia had done was not victory through firepower or numbers. It was victory through denial. The earth itself had been turned into a weapon. The empty villages, the burnt fields, the frozen silence, all of it spoke the same sentence. You can take our land, but you cannot use it. And that, in the end, is how empires die. Not by defeat in battle, but by starvation of purpose. They said it was a retreat. It was not. It was a slow dying, 1 step, 1 mile, 1 heartbeat at a time. By the end of November 1812, Napoleon's army was no longer an army at all. It was a procession of shadows moving west through white silence. Men wrapped in rags that had once been uniforms, muskets turned into walking sticks. Cannon abandoned, wheels frozen to the earth. The only sound, boots cracking in the frost, and the wind whispering through the dead forests of Russia. Behind them, the Russian armies pressed closer. Kutuzov's main force followed slowly, content to let hunger and weather do the killing. But from the north and south, fresh Russian corps moved faster, herding the French toward one inevitable line, the river Berezina. It was a trap drawn by geography itself. On one bank, the survivors. On the other, the road to safety. Between them, a half-frozen river deep and wide, surrounded by Russian guns. When the French arrived on November 25th, the sight broke even the strongest hearts. The river was clogged with drifting ice. The air stank of decay, the remains of horses and men who had fallen through trying to cross earlier fords. The temperature fell below 20 degrees. Every breath burned the lungs. Every whisper froze on lips before it could finish. Napoleon stood on a small rise overlooking the bank. His face was pale, his coat rimmed with frost. Around him his marshals waited. Ney, Oudinot, Victor, the last of his titans. Behind them, what remained of their corps, barely 40,000 men, staggered in silence. It was the final gamble. There was no bridge, no boats, no time. The engineers were summoned, General Jean-Baptiste Eblé, commander of the Pontonniers, men whose hands had built bridges across half of Europe. But now they were without proper tools or timber. They scavenged whatever they could, wagons, doors, frozen planks torn from ruined houses. They worked waist-deep in icy water, hands bleeding, faces blistered from the cold. Many died as they worked, collapsing silently under the water. But still the bridge rose, one log at a time. By dawn of November 26th, 2 bridges stood, trembling, creaking, impossibly fragile but real. On one, the infantry began to cross. On the other, the wagons and artillery. The river roared beneath, choked with ice and corpses. Russian guns thundered from the far bank. Cannonballs smashed through the bridges, sending men screaming into the freezing current. Horses slipped, wagons overturned, men fought to stay on the planks. There were moments of impossible courage. French engineers standing waist-deep in the water, hammering nails while cannonballs fell around them. Drummers who refused to stop beating cadence even as splinters tore their faces. Soldiers throwing their coats to comrades already turning blue. In that hell of ice and fire, discipline returned, not out of command but out of shared desperation. By noon, tens of thousands had crossed, but chaos reigned. Civilians, camp followers, wounded men clogged the bridge. Russian artillery found its range. The air turned to smoke and screams. The bridges began to give way. Napoleon, watching from the far side, knew the moment had come. He had to choose: save the army, or save what remained of the rear guard still trapped across the water. He chose the army. At sunset, Eblé's men, those who were still alive, were ordered to burn the bridges. They hesitated only for seconds, then obeyed. Flames rose, devouring the frozen planks. On the far bank, thousands of soldiers, women, children, and wounded cried out as the last hope collapsed into the river. Many jumped, trying to swim across. None made it. That night, the snow covered the bodies and the Berezina froze over them. Napoleon said later, "Of all my battles, the most terrible was crossing the Berezina, but it was also the one that showed what men can endure." He was right, but endurance had its cost. When the roll was taken days later, fewer than 10,000 men could still bear arms. The Grande Armée, that engine of conquest which had carried Europe on its back, had ceased to exist. The Berezina was more than a river. It was the grave of an empire's illusion. That genius could defy geography, that willpower could outlast winter, that men could eat snow and still fight. The survivors moved west in silence, their faces hollow, their eyes frostbitten, their thoughts empty. Behind them, Russia was quiet again. The land had done its work. The road west from the Berezina was not a retreat anymore. It was an exodus. The survivors moved through blizzards like ghosts, wrapped in tattered blankets, leaning on muskets that no longer fired. Horses, those few still alive, were skeletons on legs, their ribs shining through frost. The road was littered with the dead, but no one stopped to bury them. There was no strength left for ceremony. Somewhere in that endless column walked Napoleon, once the master of Europe, now just a man walking beside ruin. His once proud marshals had stopped saluting. They barely spoke. They had no food, no maps, and no illusion of control. Men died standing, eyes open, turned into ice statues by the cold. The snow covered them in silence, erasing rank, uniform, and nation. The Grande Armée had become a single shape: suffering. By the time they reached Vilnius, there was nothing left to command. Fewer than 20,000 soldiers crossed the border alive. The rest, frozen, captured, or vanished into the white. The French soldiers called it la neige de la mort, the snow of death. Napoleon's legend had always been built on speed, order, and precision. But in Russia, none of those weapons mattered. The distances were too vast, the seasons too cruel, the people too stubborn to break. He had defeated kings and coalitions, but not patience. Russia had not fought him. It had absorbed him. The disaster spread faster than the snow. Across Europe, whispers became headlines. The invincible emperor, beaten not by armies but by winter. The allies he had cowed began to stir: Prussia, Austria, even his former satellites. The empire trembled, sensing blood. Napoleon returned to Paris ahead of his army, racing through the night in a small sleigh, face hidden by a fur collar. He arrived unannounced, as if ashamed to be seen in daylight. At the Tuileries Palace, he called his ministers. "The Emperor of Russia has refused peace," he said flatly. "I will raise another army." The room was silent. No one dared to ask, with what men, with what horses, with what hope? But Napoleon was not a man built for despair. Even in ruin, he turned defeat into motion. Within months, new conscripts were marching again under the tricolor. The machine of empire still moved, but something had changed. The aura, the myth. Before Russia, Napoleon had seemed more than human. After Russia, he was only human. In the villages of France, mothers whispered to their sons, "Don't be sent to Russia." In the salons of Europe, diplomats whispered, "The god of war bleeds." The campaign had not just broken an army. It had broken faith. Faith in invincibility and destiny, in the idea that one man's will could bend a continent forever. The fire that had once lit his conquests now flickered in his eyes as exhaustion. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russian winter still held the land in its grip. Along the roads from Smolensk to Vilnius, the frozen remains of the Grande Armée lay in long lines, muskets still clutched in stiff hands, buttons glinting like stars under frost. Crows and wolves finished what the cold had started. Kutuzov, hearing reports of the retreat, said only, "Let the frost be our general." It had been, and it had won without mercy. But victory had its own price. Russia itself was scarred, burned fields, dead towns, a capital in ashes. Yet for the first time it felt united. Moscow's fire had become more than a tragedy, it was a symbol, a reminder that some nations win not by surviving, but by refusing to surrender even to survival. For Napoleon, the fire never left him. In his letters from exile, he would still write of Moscow as that phantom of flame that burned my destiny. The scorched walls of the Kremlin lived in his memory like an accusation. He had thought he could defeat Russia by taking its heart. But Russia's heart was not in Moscow. It was in the endless steppe, the hunger, the silence, and in the will to burn everything rather than kneel. The war that began with drums and banners ended in whispers and frost. An emperor had crossed half the world to find glory, and found nothing but smoke. When spring finally came to Russia, it revealed not victory but ruin. The snow melted to expose fields filled with bones, human and horse alike, scattered like broken armor across a land that had refused to die. Moscow was a skeleton city, its domes blackened, its walls cracked. The peasants came back to find ashes where their homes had been. Yet in those ashes they found pride. They had given everything, and won. What had begun as a military campaign had become something deeper, a war of existence. Napoleon had brought an empire built on logic and precision into a land ruled by chaos and endurance. He had believed that every problem could be solved by movement, calculation, and will. Russia answered with stillness, distance, and time. It was not strategy in the Western sense. It was survival turned into a weapon. The scorched earth policy was never written as doctrine. It was born from instinct, a collective understanding that to deny the enemy sustenance was to deny him power. Villages burned their own grain. Armies destroyed bridges behind them. Even the land seemed to conspire, swallowing roads in mud and freezing rivers solid when the enemy needed them most. It was war not of confrontation but of erosion, and no genius, not even Napoleon, could outthink erosion. Across Europe, the shock was immediate. The invincible emperor undone not by men but by a strategy of absence. The old rules of war had cracked. Power was no longer measured by armies but by endurance. Diplomats and generals studied the Russian campaign like a disease, something to understand, something to avoid. Every empire afterward would remember it. Don't invade the vastness, don't fight the cold, don't underestimate the will of people who have nothing left to lose. The campaign also rewrote the map of Europe, not with treaties but with memory. Prussia rose again, inspired by revenge. Britain tightened its blockade. Austria regained courage. Within 3 years, Napoleon would be defeated, not on the battlefield of Russia, but by the echo of it. At Leipzig, then Waterloo. His empire had died in the snow long before it died in law. And Russia, for all its destruction, emerged transformed. For the first time, it had stood alone against the strongest empire in the world, and watched that empire crumble. The fire that consumed Moscow became a myth passed from one generation to another. The idea that Russia's greatest weapon was not its size nor its soldiers, but its endurance, the ability to absorb pain until the invader broke first. In Paris, Napoleon tried to rewrite the story. He spoke of the treachery of climate, of unnatural frost. But deep down, he knew. The defeat was not the weather's. It was his own. He had met an opponent that refused to play by the rules of conquest. He had discovered that control, his greatest talent, had limits. In the years that followed, the phrase, "the Russian winter," would enter legend, but it missed the truth. It wasn't the winter that defeated him. It was the decision made long before the snow fell. The decision to burn Moscow, to abandon comfort for survival, to turn one's own land into fire. That act was both sacrifice and strategy, a paradox only a desperate nation could understand. The fire of Moscow was more than destruction. It was declaration. It said, "You can take our cities, but not our will." It said, "We would rather burn than bow." And in that moment, an empire that measured victory in territory met a nation that measured victory in endurance, and lost. 2 centuries later, the lesson remains. No army, no leader, no empire is invincible when it fights against a people willing to destroy what they love to preserve who they are. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the sword or the cannon, but the match. The fire that consumed Moscow did not end with smoke. It became the spark that burned through the myth of Napoleon himself and rewrote the logic of war forever.